In a 2003 article, "Are You Living in a Computer Simulation?", Nick Bostrom, probably unexpectedly to himself, initiated an enormous discussion that still goes on in various places of the internet and elsewhere today about what is sometimes called simulation theory, the idea that the world that we experience and live in, all of reality as we know it, is actually just part of a computer simulation or is itself a computer simulation, and we ourselves are simulated beings within that simulation. Now, upon first hearing of this theory, it might sound pretty crazy, like something that a teenager with too much time on their hands and probably smoking too much pot might cook up. It's taken off on the internet with lots of people producing memes such as these, and even Elon Musk giving some vocal agreement with the logic of the basic argument. So what I want to do in the rest of this video is suspend the initial disbelief that this is a crazy and impossible idea, and look at the specific reasoning that Bostrom gives in support of the thesis. In reconstructing the reasoning, I'm going to operate at a pretty high level. I'm going to try to capture the basic structure of the argument and the main pieces of evidence that Bostrom offers in support of it, and hopefully by the end of the video you will yourself have a good sense of what Bostrom's main thesis in this paper is and how he argues for that thesis. In the introduction to the paper, Bostrom writes the following, and this basically summarizes his entire argument. He writes, "Many works of science fiction, as well as some forecasts by serious technologists and futurologists," incidentally, you can think of Kurzweil here as an example of what he's talking about, "predict that enormous amounts of computing power will be available in the future. Let us suppose for a moment that these predictions are correct. One thing that later generations might do with their super powerful computers is run detailed simulations of their forebears or of people like their forebears. Because their computers would be so powerful, they could run a great many such simulations. Suppose that these simulated people are conscious, as they would be if simulations were sufficiently fine-grained and if that were enough for a computer program to become conscious, which is a controversial thesis, but one that's widely accepted in the field known as philosophy of mind, which is basically the area of philosophy that debates questions like what are the necessary conditions and sufficient conditions of consciousness, what is required to bring about a conscious being. So Bostrom notes that it's controversial, the idea that a computer simulation or program could be conscious, but many people believe that it's possible. And so if we make that assumption as well here, then certain interesting consequences follow. Then it could be the case, so this is Bostrom drawing some consequences of the futurologist's prediction that there will be future civilizations that can and do produce large-scale simulations that include conscious beings in them. Okay, he says, then it could be the case that the vast majority of minds like ours, do not belong to the original race, but to people simulated by the advanced descendants of an original race. In other words, it could be that the vast majority of minds like yours or mine, that is, whoever it is that's having this experience right now of making this lecture or listening to this lecture, that minds like ours, most of them are simulations rather than real biological minds, let's say. It's then possible to argue that if this were the case, that is, if most minds like ours are simulations, then we would be rational to think that we're likely among the simulated minds rather than among the original biological ones, for basic statistical reasons, that we're more likely, if more minds like ours are simulated rather than physically instantiated, then we're probably more likely, or we are more likely to be, without there being any additional evidence that sways us one way or the other, we should say it's more likely that we're simulations than that we're physical minds. Therefore, if we don't think that we're currently living in a computer simulation, we're not entitled to believe that we'll have descendants who will run lots of such simulations of their forebears. And then conversely, of course, if we do think that future civilizations will run such simulations, then we should think that we're almost certainly in a computer program, that we are in a simulation. That is the basic idea, Bostrom concludes. The rest of this paper will spell it out more carefully. And that, I think, summarizes Bostrom's argument as a whole in the paper, that one of two things must be the case. Either there will be these future simulations and we ourselves are probably one of those simulations, or there won't be such future simulations. Now, on this slide, I've tried to summarize this argument in what philosophers and logicians call standard form. Basically, this articulates a set of premises and some conclusions. And this set of premises and conclusions really only captures one side of Bostrom's argument, namely the side that proceeds from certain judgments that the future is likely to contain such simulations to the conclusion that we are probably simulations rather than physical or physically instantiated minds. And a thing to note here is that the way that Bostrom's reasoning in the argument as a whole works is to say that if we don't want to accept this conclusion, that is, if we want to disagree that we're living in a computer simulation, then we must, for logical reasons, we must have to disagree with one of the premises, because these conclusions follow necessarily from these premises. So if we accept those premises, then the conclusion follows that we're probably in a computer simulation. If we want to, or we're very suspicious of the conclusion, we don't want to believe we're living in a computer simulation, then logically what we have to do, if this argument Bostrom has laid out is a good one, then logically what we have to do is disagree with one of the premises. We have to say that either P1 is false, or P2 is false, or P3 is false. So this raises the question of, where do you stand in relation to this argument at this point in your understanding? Are you inclined to agree with these premises and follow Bostrom to the conclusion that we're probably living in a computer simulation? As I mentioned before, Elon Musk has made statements to the effect that he is convinced by this argument, or he can't find the problem in it. Or alternatively, do you disagree with one of P1, P2, or P3? And if you disagree with one of those, which one is it? And why?